Nō mai, haere mai, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Iran is facing a life-threatening and regime-threatening drought. But as the latest Global Climate Summit wraps up in Brazil, Iran is just one of a growing number of nations facing the politically destabilising effects of climate change. Welcome, Robert.
You're welcome, Bruce. Thank you.
Iran has endured several years of drought. Now there's even talk of evacuating the 10 million inhabitants of the capital, Tehran. What sort of threat does this drought pose to the Ayatollahs who have controlled Iran for decades?
I think it's a very threatening situation. As you indicated in your opening remarks, the situation in Iran, particularly Tehran, is extremely difficult. 10 million, it's got a population of 10 million people, and the Iranian government has signalled that they may have to evacuate the citizens of Tehran. Now, where will they go? But I think that scenario, and the current scenario, evacuation is perhaps, if you like, a medium to long-term response. In the short term, they may have to introduce water rationing unless there is a sudden improvement in the drought. That is, there's a break in the drought that's really pushing this along. But Tehran apparently has been subject to water shortages for some time now. So it's a very sensitive issue for the government because the government, as we've discussed before, have been subject to wide-ranging sanctions. So their economy has been struggling. So what are the specific pressures? First of all, I think the whole question of the legitimacy of the government. Many people's lives will be seriously inconvenient through either water rationing or fuel rationing, power reduction, their inability to prepare meals and things like that, reductions in electricity supply. All these things flow from this sort of scenario. And you can imagine that could lead to serious unrest, even among those people who feel quite committed to the government. So I think there could be a serious erosion of legitimacy, is one of the biggest in political terms, for a regime which has been under pressure for some time. I think the second thing is it will certainly have damaging economic consequences. And the Iranian economy is already in a fragile state. And, you know, it could almost push Iran over the edge in economic terms. So I suppose, in short, what's threatening here for the Ayatollahs, the clerical regime, I should say, in Tehran, is that this water shortage crisis in the capital of the country could have damaging political and economic fallout for the regime, and may even lead to calls within Iran for a regime change. And it was the third thing that we should note here. It will empower long-standing opponents, and there's plenty of them within Iran. They'll be given, fresh momentum by these events.
This week, US President Donald Trump has said that he wants to get involved to try and end the terrible conflict in Sudan. There are also ongoing civil and transnational conflicts in countries including Yemen and Mali, Syria, Democratic Republic of Congo. What role is climate change playing in global conflict here at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century?
Well, first of all, for the most powerful country in the world, it's playing no role whatsoever. Of course, according to President Trump, climate change is a hoax. So there's no American delegation at the UN's climate change conference, the 30th, which has been held in Belém in Brazil. So that's one thing to establish, and that matters. If you've got the most powerful country in the world and the second or third, I think it's the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, which is denying there's a problem, and this is a problem that doesn't respect borders and can only be solved by a global consensus and global action, then it's a major issue in itself. But let's put that to one side for a second. What sort of problems is climate change causing? I would say there's no single or simple relationship between climate change and conflict, but what we can say is that it's a threat multiplier. That is to say, it exacerbates existing problems. What sort of problems will be exacerbated by climate change, and how these manifesting themselves? We've seen in situations like Sudan that you mentioned, that it is increasing competition for resources, and part and parcel, one aspect of the internal conflict in Sudan, which is not getting too much attention but is very real, is the competition for control of minerals in Sudan. And also, in addition, of course, there is the problem, and we're seeing this in the Pacific Island nations. For them, climate change is the number one national security issue. Why? Because climate change is associated with rising sea levels, and for low-lying island states, that could, in the case of Tuvalu and a couple of other Pacific Island states, that literally could be an existential threat to their existence within 2 decades, according to many climate scientists. And that will have a knock-on effect. It means that countries whose existence is threatened by climate change, either existence threatened in terms of shortage of economic resources, or that their physical existence is threatened, that means there'd be migration. And if you take the example of the Pacific Island nations, New Zealand and Australia would probably have to absorb populations displaced by the effects of climate change. And it's got to be stated for the record, I believe, that at least 97%, I think 97.5% of climate scientists in the world believe climate change is a clear and present danger, which has not been addressed. This problem, Bruce, has been around since the 1980s. So a whole different conversation is why we haven't really addressed it. It's very difficult to get consensus in anything internationally, and we haven't got the machinery to achieve that either, because at the moment we have the most authoritative decision-making body within the UN is the UN Security Council, and this is a national security issue, by the way. And yet, as we've seen, the UN Security Council is paralysed by the use of the veto. It only takes one country within the UN Security Council, one of the permanent five, one of the 5 countries which has got the veto, to block or veto a resolution to tackle climate change, and that effectively blocks the problem, prevents a solution to the problem. So yeah, this is a very serious problem, and I can't help thinking that although we've got a president that's in climate change denial, we will sooner or later have a president who will have to face up to this problem, because the United States can't affect the consequences. It's experiencing extreme weather, just as other parts of the world are. So at some point you can postpone the problem, but you can't dodge it, ultimately. You can, as one once said, you can run but you can't hide, and I think that certainly applies to climate change.
Right. We've talked a little bit about the COP30, the climate summit that's been in Brazil, and wrapping up a fortnight of attempts to find global responses to climate change. Is there anything else to say about what is at stake here?
I think one of the most interesting developments, I mean, first of all, it's not over yet. So, I think it's a bit premature to say exactly what it's achieved. I do think it's timely. It's been weakened by the fact the US isn't present, for reasons we've already touched on. But one interesting issue is most countries are present, and there does seem to be pressure to create an international roadmap for transitioning away from fossil fuel. In other words, let's have an internationally agreed plan. This is what's under discussion at COP30. How do we move away to a global economy that no longer relies on fossil fuels for energy? And what's interesting about that, and perhaps really important, is that if such a roadmap could be created, then countries which are laggards can be held to account against an international benchmark. And it's no secret that our country has somewhat, according to international observers retreated a little bit on its climate change commitments. But I think if an international roadmap's in place, such retreats may be more difficult to operationalise. But again, that hasn't been agreed, and it's very difficult to get agreement amongst 190 odd countries.
We are seeing climate change beginning to destabilise countries around the world. What could this realistically mean for New Zealand? You've already touched on it. Can you expand on that?
Well, I do think New Zealand sees its area of influence as the Pacific Island nations. We have very close people-to-people contacts. There's a large Pacifica population in New Zealand, and we see that as our special area, our backyard, our special area of influence. 60% of our development aid goes to the Pacific Island nations. So, in a sense, for New Zealand, the challenge is, I believe, to firmly back Pacific Island nations in their demand that climate change is the number one security issue. And we do have an enlightened self-interest in supporting them in doing this, because if the situation deteriorates to a point where there is significant forced displacement of populations within the Pacific Island nations, as I said before, New Zealand will be expected to assume responsibility for that relocation, along with Australia. So, in a sense, we have a stake in trying to head off the problem as much as we can. And to be fair, this government and previous governments, I think, have been very supportive of the idea that climate change is the number one problem. Looked at from a Pacific Island nation's point of view, they believe that flirtations with things like AUKUS, this enhanced security arrangement between Australia and the UK and the United States, is something of a distraction. And they certainly, one message that's coming out of Pacific Island nations is they certainly do not want to see their future either aligned tightly with the United States or with China. They have their own national security concerns that they want addressing. And I think there's a fair amount of anger, not just in the Pacific Island, but amongst developing countries in general, because they've probably made only a marginal contribution to a problem that's been largely created by the countries which industrialised first, which are in the industrialised north, basically, the northern hemisphere. And this problem is not going away, and it has got significant geopolitical implications.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.